Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining ACI World's press briefing on its new COVID-19 economic impact analysis and the path to recovery, as we mark 1 year since the global lockdown began. This is the first in a series of quarterly press briefings that we will use to provide you with the latest data to explore the continuing economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and look at prospects for a global recovery of the airport sector. My name is David Whiteley. I am ACI World's Vice President for Marketing and Communications. I'm today joined by our Director General Felipe de Oliveira, Vice President for Economics Patrick Lucas, and Senior Director Economic Analysis and Statistical Services Janik Gagne. Felipe, Patrick, and Janik will present ACI World's latest findings and will then open the floor for questions. If you'd like to put a question to the panel, please send it to us through the chat function, and we'll address many of your questions as we can. So without further ado, Felipe, I'll ask you to lead us off with some opening remarks.
Thank you, David. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depends on the part of the world you are. We are here in the sunny Montreal today. Of course, everybody's still working from home, looking forward to fly again, safe and health in different parts of the world. It's safe to say that we are feeling the impacts of the very different world. A year ago, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak a global pandemic. With the biggest vaccination campaign in the history underway, with more than 480 million doses administered across over 135 countries, there is a sign of fresh optimism on the horizon, and that is good. Despite of this, the COVID-19 remains an existential crisis for airports, airlines, and their commercial partners, and we need the support in a sensible policy decisions from the governments to ensure that aviation can fuel the global economic recovery. The new data that we will discuss today show a dramatic impact in the pandemic, in the reduction of the passenger traffic, and revenue persists and continue to work with the global organizations, governments, and regulators toward the harmonized recovery. Although the situation remains tough, we remain hopeful that the upsurge of the confidence in air travel will provide by the vaccination and safety measures should result in a higher number of people traveling abroad this spring and significantly increase by mid of the year. ACI recently welcomed the updated guidance published by ICAO Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, the CART. The guidance will provide immeasurable assistance in promoting the harmonization that we must need with the measures to be introduced around the world to facilitate the restart of their travel, and they will allow the aviation to be a key engine on the driving global and economic recovery. Furthermore, the digital health passengers trials, such as Common Pass in Aruba, are presenting a strong case for using the digital technology to deliver a globally harmonized approach for validation and authentication of testing and vaccination. Establishing an interoperable health and data trust framework to facilitate safe border reopening and cross-border travel will be a key to support the global recovery. ACI is supportive of any system which will allow testing and vaccination data to be shared consistently, effectively, and the way that protects the personal data for those that use it. IATA Travel Pass, OK Travel Pass, and others will play a key role in the world as the world will adopt different systems. For example, we applaud the Good Health Pass collaborative initiative that is focused on privacy protection, user control, interoperability, and widely accepted international for travel. As part of the aviation system ecosystem continue to make small steps towards recovery, a coordinated and globally consistent approach to vaccination and testing, coupled with interoperable methods of sharing testing and vaccination, information remains a key, safe, secure, and health-conscious restart and the recovery of our sector. The world is changing fast, and the COVID-19's impact on the industry has been far greater than what we have previously experienced. Recovery will once again require heightened levels of collaboration and partnership among the industry stakeholders. Airports cannot do it alone. We are all in this together. We need to learn as much as we can from this experience and try to anticipate and prepare for the various ways in which things could unfold in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe, for setting the scene. Now, ACI World's Director of Economics, Patrick Lucas, will dive into some of the detail of the analysis, followed by Janik. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, David. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you on this important topic. I'd like to just give you a brief summary of the data and information both Janik and I will present. To get a relative sense of the downturn, it's useful to look at where we were. So give you kind of this historical analysis. Then I'd like to kind of move into 2021 and give you the current outlook. I'd also like to look beyond the crisis and give you kind of the longer term forecasts and what are some of the underlying fundamentals. And then finally, my colleague Janik will talk a bit more on air cargo and what's happening there. So as mentioned, it's useful to have a historical glimpse to get a relative sense of where we are now. Now, if we look back at the last, say, 10 years, it could almost be regarded as a golden era of aviation with year-over-year growth of over 5% and with emerging markets posting even higher growth. Now, nevertheless, even over that period, going back to 2010, there were a number of events that created adverse impacts. We had the H1N1 swine flu. There was a MERS outbreak in the Middle East, Ebola outbreak in West Africa, a Zika outbreak. We had terrorist activity at Brussels and Istanbul airports, Russian and Brazilian recessions, the Euro area crisis, the list goes on. Now, many of these events were localized and passenger traffic continued on with a level of resilience. So through either destination switching or quick recoveries. Now, of course, those pale in comparison to the current pandemic and crisis. Now, as we moved into 2020 and the pandemic was declared and travel restrictions were imposed, we could see the collapse of traffic by March. Now, by the month of April, and this is when we slipped into the deepest depths, the abyss of the crisis, we see the commencement of the great lockdown. In April, we could see traffic declining by almost 95%, okay, in April of last year. Now, hopefully the darkest days are now behind us in terms of overall traffic declines, but it was quite significant. Now, if we look at what this means in terms of passenger numbers, the crisis has actually removed over 6 billion passengers by the end of 2020. And this is compared to the projected baseline. So meaning what was projected before COVID-19. So overall, this represents a decline of 65% in global passenger traffic. Now, naturally, revenues are very much tightly correlated to traffic levels, okay, on both what is called the aeronautical and the non-aeronautical revenue streams. So the aeronautical revenues relate very much to the charges that are levied on users of infrastructure, so passengers and airlines and so on. The non-aeronautical revenue or commercial activities relate to concessions, so retail, duty-free, car parking, and also property and real estate. Now, for the year as a whole, we are looking at a loss of about 125 billion USD. So you could see the aggregate magnitude of this loss on the chart on the right-hand side. Now, it begs the question, what does this mean? How do we visualize this 125 billion? What does it look like? Well, if we take the typical airport hub, and this is a hub that handles over 40 million passengers per annum, okay? Well, these airports generate on average, okay, some a bit more, some a bit less, but on average about 1.3 billion USD per annum. So this loss is equivalent to, say, having the 95 busiest hubs in the world, having their revenues completely wiped out, okay, just to give you a scale of the magnitude. Now, the big challenge with our industry is that airports remain a capital-intensive business. Like other infrastructure-intensive businesses, this means that there are high fixed costs, right, with highly leveraged debt levels. So at least 35% of costs are directly fixed. However, many operating expenses also remain semi-fixed, okay? So even with low traffic levels, there are certain services and utilities that need to be put in place to guarantee the safety of passengers, but also for cargo operations. Now, with the collapse in traffic, I mean, many airports are faced with debt levels or debt to EBITDA levels that are not sustainable. Now, let's move to just the broader impacts that extend beyond airports and the aviation ecosystem. So working with partners across the industry, the Air Transport Action Group, ATAG, puts together the aviation benefits beyond borders every couple of years. I mean, typically we look at the multiplier or positive impact of aviation. Now, because travel has come to a halt, we are now looking at this multiplier impact in reverse, okay? So this includes the direct negative impact of the industry, but also the indirect, induced, and the tourism catalytic impacts as well. So in essence, this entire supplier value chain, all the way down to tourism-related industries, and here I'm referring to hotels, restaurants, museums, and other attractions, and so on, are affected. And a key point to note here, when we talk about tourism, 57% of tourists arrive by air, okay, which is a fundamental lifeline for many of these industries. On this slide, we see the impact on GDP. So if we consider only aviation's direct impact, so the simulated impact on economic activities supported by air transport is high, and this is in pre-pandemic times, it's comparable to the GDP of say Indonesia or the Netherlands. Now with the pandemic, we see a domino effect. With an over 50% reduction compared to a pre-COVID situation, or a 1.8 trillion drop in GDP supported by aviation. Now, this is due to, of course, a slow recovery impacting the catalytic benefits of aviation-supported tourism, but also the reduction in investment by airports, and infrastructure, by airlines, and other parts of the sector. Now, within the aviation ecosystems, jobs at airports make up the largest share. So historically speaking, this has always been in the realm of 55 to 60% of the overall employment in the sector. The typical hub has as many as 40,000 employees working on site in some shape or capacity. Now, beyond employees for airport operators and airlines, many of these jobs are in many other areas: duty-free, retail, car rental services, and other government-related services. Now, of all the sectors within this ecosystem, the largest decline is felt by those working on the airport site. And this represents a potential 55% decline, of course, if certain government programs or wage subsidies were not in place. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So this is a very good image of the state of affairs with respect to international travel. Now, as many of you know, mobility and the supply of international travel around the globe has been significantly curtailed as a result of the restrictions aimed at curbing the spread of COVID-19 and, of course, its variants. Now, on this slide, this is something by Kayak. IATA also produces a useful regulations map, but the Kayak one has a bit more detail. So anywhere you see the pink or red color, which is basically a large proportion of the map, you have some type of restriction. And here, partially open basically includes any countries that have quarantines. So if we look at this through the lens of leisure travel, I mean, you could also consider these in some sense closed. Now, unfortunately, and Felipe mentioned this, travel restrictions, I mean, remain largely uncoordinated. Generally, we maintain that government action to promote safe travel with a coordinated and risk-based approach to testing and vaccination is crucial instead of full-scale restrictions and these blanket quarantines. Now, as a result of all this, you end up with a dichotomy. So international travel remains suppressed with declines of 85% year over year. On the other hand, domestic markets have shown a glimmer of hope with a bounce back. So in December and January, domestic markets were down by around 50% comparatively speaking. Now, in some markets, we do see a form of vaccine optimism and what has been coined as vacation deprivation, in the media and other spheres. So there is this pent-up demand and appetite for travel. Now, it's important to note that some very sizable domestic markets have come very close to full recovery, such as China and Russia. And then you also have some other big domestic markets like India, Japan, Mexico, Thailand, and the US also accelerating on the domestic front. And you could see that on these charts, especially on the right-hand side there, you could see the blue line approaching this red line. Now, this chart here is an important one. Many of our forecasts over the short term, which feed into the medium term, so over the next 5 years, very much hinge on the effectiveness of vaccines and the supply chain to deploy the vaccines to a significant proportion of the population so as to develop herd immunity. Now, in some respect, the scenarios here and the uncertainty range that is characterized by the yellow region between the green and red lines, okay? And the dotted line is an earlier forecast from early January. Now, with tighter international restrictions recently put in place at the start in some major markets and a very bad January with new cases and variants, downside risks remain with traffic remaining subdued. Even with the surge in some domestic markets, we'll see the biggest uptick as a result of pent-up demand, but also because of reductions in COVID-19 cases and vaccine rollout, very much happening in H2 or the second half of 2021. Now, by the end of 2021, we're expecting to be in the 45 to 55% range of 2019 levels. Again, there is this pent-up demand. People do have some accumulated savings and would travel if they could. So there is a strong possibility we get back onto the dotted line after 2021, after restrictions are lifted. Now, if we look at the baseline scenario, which assumes that a good proportion of vaccines will be rolled out in 2021 in major markets, traffic is expected to get back to 2019 levels by the end of 2023. International markets will take longer, unfortunately. If you look at the bottom left-hand chart, we expect traffic levels to get back by 2024 based on the baseline scenario. Now, of course, there are certain markets like Europe, which is heavily dependent on international traffic and international transfer passengers. This may take even longer, so 2025 or even later. Now, where are we going? I'd like to just take a kind of a longer-term view beyond the current crisis. Now, when we think about the future traffic mix based on the reason to travel, it's useful to look at this both historically but also through the lens of the pandemic to see what the future holds in terms of passenger profiles. So whether that means business travel, leisure travel, or visiting friends and family, or for education, or so on. While we will definitely get back on track in terms of getting back to 2019 levels, one thing that is less clear is the potential traffic mix and breakdown when we get back on track. So the data in this slide comes from the great work that some of my colleagues in airport service quality put together. Now, even before the pandemic, we saw a proportional decline in business passengers based on the purpose for traveling. Now, it's important to note that leisure traffic was growing quite significantly above and beyond business travel, whereas business travel was a bit more stagnant in terms of growth. So there's no doubt that technology, of course, through virtual meetings, what we're doing now, has brought a number of productivity gains in terms of time savings. That is not to say that business travel will experience a complete drastic decline. However, the opportunity costs of various types of business travel are and will be analyzed more deeply. Now, certain companies may, of course, substitute away from travel in favor of virtual meetings. However, face-to-face interactions and the human element, especially in business relationships and meeting with clients, I mean, that will never be replaced, right? So the image below basically shows this spectrum of business travel with the polar, call it the polar opportunity costs, which is very much interrelated with call it the price sensitivity, okay, based on the type of business travel. And then you will have all other activities on the spectrum of business travel in between here, of course, including traveling to conferences, networking, company training, and so on. Now, looking even longer term and kind of past all this, the noise and fury, we could potentially see this as kind of the good news here. The long-term fundamentals of the industry very much still apply. We need to be cognizant of the demography of aviation. Many markets have seen aviation open up over the last couple of decades, and we have also seen the propensity to travel rise quickly with the rises in income. I mean, interestingly, and 80% of the world's population resides in emerging markets and developing economies. If we look at these four markets, so China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, these four markets alone, and these are markets with huge domestic markets, it represents about 40% of the world's population, okay? Now, our longer-term forecasts are very much based on the long-term fundamentals of projected income levels, the cost of travel, but also this interrelationship with the demography of aviation. Interestingly, many countries have just peaked or will peak in the years to come. And here I'm referring more to the emerging markets in terms of the working age population. So this means the age between 15 and 65 years. Those populations are peaking in emerging markets. And as a result of that, of course, the propensity to travel increases accordingly. Now, that's emerging markets. There's, of course, very important feedback loops to the more mature markets as well, of Europe and North America. So every region stands to benefit from these underlying fundamentals. So that's kind of a quick glimpse at the passenger side and the expected recovery scenarios. I'd like to now just pass it on to my colleague Janik for air cargo.
Thank you, Patrick. And let me just conclude this briefing with a couple of quick notes on air cargo. So obviously, air cargo plays a central role in the fight of COVID, moving the personal protective equipment and the vaccine. But there's a big misconception about air cargo. We hear a lot about booming air cargo volume. And this is partly fueled by some of the front page that we saw over the last month. And don't get me wrong, I find it also pretty impressive to see the biggest aircraft in the world, the Antonov 225, with hundreds or thousands of boxes of masks being offloaded. And sometimes we even see it on live TV, like when it came here in Mirabel here in Montreal. We hear a lot also about passenger aircraft being temporarily converted into freighter. What we hear less or what we know less is about the huge the capacity, belly capacity cargo decline because of the sharp decline in aircraft movement. So in average, about 40% of air cargo is carried in the belly of passenger aircraft. And with the decline of almost half of the movement in 2020, and it's even worse if you look at the wide-body aircraft, which is normally the type of aircraft that is providing the most belly capacity. Belly cargo capacity was reduced significantly. If you look at the equation that we have on the bottom right corner of the page, you also need to add the decrease in what I call the normal cargo volume, which is the electronics or the machine parts that are normally transported in normal time. And this is down right now and was down in 2020, mostly because of the economic downturn. So what is the combined effect of of all those conflicting forces? The combined effect is that in 2020, air cargo volume dropped by 12% compared to 2019. Only North America recorded positive numbers, and it was mostly fueled by the retail, the online retail. Overall, the global air cargo volume came back to 2019 level in December, and we see in our preliminary results for January that this trend, positive trend, will continue, and we projected around 4.4% increase in January, and this will just continue as airline. Hopefully, will continue as airline are putting back some aircraft online and especially wide-body aircraft. So just to give also a quick comparison to end this, obviously cargo didn't suffer as much as passenger. In the 2020 level of cargo are more comparable to what cargo was in 2014, 2015. If you look at passenger, the 2020 passenger level is more comparable to what we saw in 1994. So with this, we're passing it back to David.
Thank you, Felipe, Patrick, and Janik for that dive into the detail and also that look at cargo at the end there. We have the opportunity now to address your questions, so please continue to send them to the chat function and we'll get through as many of them as we can. The first comes on something that Felipe mentioned initially and Patrick touched on as well in his presentation about all the talk around health passes and vaccine passports. And how they could be a key to facilitating a return to air travel. So Felipe, maybe first, what do you think is the key to making this work best? Obviously, we're hearing about quite a few different passes that are being developed. So how can this all be worked together to bring about a return to air travel?
Thank you, David, and a very good question. First of all, thank you very much for you to attending this press conference. And we hope in November, when we have our global meeting in Buenos Aires, we will be all together and we have the opportunity to speak about these topics face to face, as we believe that the recovery will start to come sooner than later. The importance of the health passes, as we mentioned before, they are a key element to help the governments to take the actions in over the borders. Basically, to have a system that allows the governments to understand that the vaccines and tests taken in different countries are allowed, are legible, and are interoperable. That's why if I need to enumerate three things that are important in terms of the health passes, first is the interoperability. We have different passes working around the world. We have tests that are already in place, like the Common Pass in Aruba. We have others as well, like OK Pass and good developments from IATA on the Travel Pass and many others. But each of these passes doesn't communicate one each other. We will end up with the different governments take different decisions regarding the technology they are using, and we end up with the passenger in the passenger journey using different health passes around the globe. That's why the interoperability of these systems are key. The interoperability of these systems are key because they will allow us to travel safe, bring the governments the security that they are receiving passengers with the right data and the right information regarding vaccines and regarding the tests. And in addition, of course, bring security for the passage that this data is protected. The second point I think is that we need to mention is the testing and vaccination. And nowadays, people are not traveling because they are feared. They are not traveling because the tests and vaccinations are not replacing the quarantines in different countries. That's why the health passes will play a key role as well on the allowing people to start to move again, and the vaccinations and tests be allowed to cross the borders and access different countries. And the third one is the harmonization among the countries. The countries need to be harmonized to understand and to have the clarity that tests taken in different parts of the world are genuine and are protected for them to receive their passengers and tourists from the different parts of the world. That's why, in a nutshell, that is the most important topics that I'd like to share regarding the travel passes.
Thanks, Felipe. Moving on, we're getting quite a couple of questions around what we described earlier as an existential crisis for the industry, and things about airport insolvency or bankruptcies. But I think this comes back to, beyond this talk of vaccine passports and health passes, etc., what are other things that governments can be doing? What other policies governments can introduce to support the longer-term recovery of air transport and stimulate demand? So how can governments get around and support the industry beyond the very high-level considerations around health passes? Perhaps Felipe could start the answer, and Patrick, you could take it from there.
Thank you, David. Harmonization is the key. I remember when we started to close the borders the last year, the countries were taking different actions, considering different levels of risk assessment and considering even levels of measures taken in the decision that they are closing or not their countries. Nowadays, after 1 year on this crisis, we have the risk assessment measures. We have the CARD document that bringing the version 3, allowing us to have the clear guidelines that what we need to do to open the borders. That's why in terms of opening the borders, the use of the CARD and the use of the guidelines that are on the CARD that was decided and aligned with the governments in the global level is the key element to restart the travel industry in safe manner as well. That's why in the first case, harmonization is a key element. And from there, I will pass to Patrick to bring some good elements as well for this.
Thank you, Felipe and David. If we kind of think, besides supporting, of course, the financial viability of the industry, but if we think even a bit longer term and we focus in on say, international travel, one area that's actually been even an issue even before the pandemic has been international taxation. So the taxes that are as a proportion of the base fare could be quite significant. So like any good or service, that's a function of income and prices, right? So demand is a function of income and prices. So we're asking governments that they help with the kind of that price factor. So when you decrease taxes, and we actually recently did a study on this, when you decrease the taxes, it acts to actually stimulate demand. So when you have more traffic, of course, that creates more contribution to GDP, what I was talking about earlier. And of course, this stimulates jobs, right? So the actual gains in terms of economic benefits actually outweigh the tax revenue that the governments get. So this is something that governments really need to kind of pay attention to. going forward over the longer term recovery.
Just to add, David, on that, if we see that the airports, the airport community represents 60% of aviation jobs, it's very important that the governments take an action as well and support this industry on the recovery as well. That's why the government support for the industry that goes beyond airlines is very important as well for us on this process to recover. I think we are all in the same ecosystem, and you need to be considered in this help that the governments could do to maintain the social and economic development that is provided by the airports and the aviation industry as well.
Excellent. Thanks. Got a good question here. Perhaps I'll direct to Patrick, and then if Janik or Felipe would like to add to it. It's about the injection of capital into airports during these times, and to see whether our shareholders of airports injecting capital. We don't see news coverage of this, unlike similar capital injection for airlines. So basically, the capital injection situation for airports at the moment. Patrick, you could lead off.
Yeah. So and this is an issue. I mean, so we're in a situation. I mean, there has been a bit of relief measures across the globe. I mean, if we start with Africa, there's been a few cases of loan guarantees. In the U.S., you had the CARES Act. In Asia Pacific, you had a bit of support for some of the Australian and New Zealand airports. In Europe, there is a few countries where there's been some financial packages, but nothing as comparable to like what Felipe was saying in terms of the airlines. Now, what airports are having to do is now they're having to refinance, and so the cost of capital is rising, this is an issue, right? So and the industry is very much in this precarious situation right now, and it's fundamental that something happens soon. I don't know if maybe Janik or Felipe you'd like to kind of add to that.
Maybe Felipe and then Janik, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, just to jump in, don't take me wrong when I said the airlines received the package and we didn't receive too much. At the end, the industry needs to receive the package, and we are very pleased that the airlines received the package because they are our main users in terms of our infrastructure. That's why if the airlines are in a good shape, we probably will be in a good shape as well. However, many airports around the world are suffering, are struggling, and basically we need to have some help. Before the crisis, around 2/3 of airports are working on deficit. And now, of course, with the crisis, 100% of our airports are working on deficit. That's why any kind of support that support us to pass through this crisis will help the socio-economic development and, of course, of the recovery of this crisis.
Yeah, maybe just to add on Felipe and Patrick. So above the operation cost, there's also the capital cost. So before the pandemic, a lot of airports were already at capacity and were needing to invest to be able to cope with the increase in passenger. Obviously, in 2020, this is a bit less of a problem. Congested airport, we didn't really see this, but it will come back. And if you look at our forecast, we forecast that traffic will double by 2038. So we will see the same capacity crunch, or the lack of capacity in some of airports. And capital investment will be required at significant level for those airports. So it was delayed maybe now, and in many of the countries, maybe not in the US, we saw some good investment there. There's some region also in Asia where the government put and use the opportunity of the crisis to inject money. But we need to think that passengers are coming back. They will coming back in force, and we will need to address the capacity issue of airports in the future.
Thanks to the panel for the answer to that one. I think we've got time for one last question for all panelists, and it's kind of a two-parter. And it's that from the data we see that recovery around the world will happen at different paces. So how will that affect the overall recovery of the global aviation ecosystem? And also, how does that relate to, we've touched on the effect on airports and the plight of smaller airports before the pandemic. But is there a real danger of, as recovery accelerates, for the smaller airports and regional airports to be left behind in this recovery? And what can we do to try and ensure that that doesn't happen? So maybe, Patrick, if you'd like to address that question, and Felipe and Janik, you'd like to add your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And that's an excellent question. I mean, if we go back even before the pandemic, smaller regional airports were typically, and I'm talking about those airports that maybe serve less than 5 million or less than 1 million passengers, were maybe just breaking even or operating at a loss. Okay. And you may ask, well, why are they operating at a loss? Well, it's because they have very high fixed costs but lower traffic throughput. And then the next question is, well, why are they there? Well, because they contribute to the kind of the economic vitality of the regions they serve. So they need to be there, right? So now as we come into the pandemic, obviously the situation has exacerbated. Now, many smaller regional airports might be a part of a network, right? So meaning that you have a major hub airport within that network that helps kind of cross-subsidize the losses of these smaller airports. But we're in a situation now where the biggest hubs in the world are their revenues have collapsed. So it's a major. So it is a major issue that we will have to think about going forward, because it's some major challenges, especially if we want to maintain the economic vitality of more remote regions.
Thank you. I think Patrick addressed it really very well, the answer. But I would like just to contribute with the catalytic effect that the airports and the aviation generate in the regions. That's why basically the regions and the airports and the tourist sector and the others are an ecosystem, and this ecosystem comes with the involvement of tourists and business travelers across these airports and these regions. That's why the impact that these small and medium airports could generate for the regions they belong to could be much higher in terms of the employment, in terms of the sustainability of the business in that parts of the world. That's why it's a key element that these airports receive certain kind of support in order to continue to operate and continue to contribute on the sustainable way to the social and economic development for the regions they belong.
Maybe, David, just to conclude, and I will twist a bit your question. Instead of talking about uneven recovery, looking at size of airport, maybe just talking about uneven recovery in terms of region. And this is where vaccination and equal access to vaccine and unequal vaccination effort throughout the globe actually is very important for our industry. For international travel, you need both regions. If you have a flight between North America and Africa is still lagging in vaccination, still have issue with variant and other problem with COVID, you will not have those international flights. So for us, for our industry to recover and for international travel to recover, we really need to make sure that there's even access to vaccination on a global level. And that's one of the key for the recovery of our industry.
David, and just to wrap up, taking advantage of the answer from Janik, vaccines and tests are key. Risk assessment from the countries are key as well. That's why we need to remind our governments that these three elements will help the industry to recover in a safe way for the countries. That's why harmonizing these three aspects globally will help us to recover the industry and again contribute for the recovery of the common economy around the world.
Thanks, Felipe. Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Janik, for a very comprehensive answer to that question. We've run out of time for our briefing today. Thank you all for joining us.